Hello and welcome to my channel. Today I'm going to do a winter landscape in graphite pencil. I'm going to take you through the drawing process. I'm going to draw some mountains. The first thing I'm going to do is secure this piece of paper with a little bit of tape. The paper I'm going to be using is a Fabriano sketching paper. The size is about 5 × 8 inches. The pencils I'm going to be using are Faber-Castell Pit Graphite Matte pencils. And I've done a review and a demonstration with these matte graphite pencils. If you want to check it out, I've done a number of drawings with them. And this time we're going to do a landscape. I'm also going to use some erasers, a kneaded eraser and a Tombow Mono Zero eraser. Now, if you look at my reference photo, which is going to be in the description, you'll see that I made some changes. So I'm starting with a sketch and with a composition. And I made some changes to the composition because parts of the scene were a little bit overstretched. I wanted to bunch things together a little bit and to make this mountain peak in the middle appear a little bit larger so that it can draw a bit more focus from the viewer. And there were some other things I didn't like. I didn't like the shape of the peak. I decided to simplify the slope on the left a little bit so that it would be a little bit easier to explain to the viewer. And there were also some peaks in the background which were kind of competing with the peak in the middle, so I decided to simplify them and omit some of them. And I also decided to make this peak in the middle a bit taller. So this is the initial sketch. This is going to be my composition with this larger snow-covered peak in the foreground and some distant mountain peaks in the background. There's also going to be some rocks and some trees here and there. But now that the sketch is done, I'm ready to start with the main part of the drawing process. And I'm going to start with a darker pencil. This is a 14B, the darkest one that I have. Now you may be wondering, why am I starting so dark immediately? Well, I often do that in my drawings, not just landscape but portraits as well, because I like to put down some of the darker details. It helps me navigate through the rest of the drawing, but it also helps me gauge how much value I'm going to need in some other parts of the drawing. So this part of this mountain peak is going to appear a bit darker simply because there are going to be some bare rocks and some trees, some distant coniferous trees on that mountain peak. Now the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to work on the sky, and I'm going to put down some graphite powder. You can buy graphite powder, or you can just create it yourself by sharpening one of your graphite pencils or graphite sticks. And once I have that graphite, I can push it around with a brush. Right now I'm doing this kind of softly. I'm not trying to push the graphite into the paper just yet. I'm just sort of distributing it because I want to make it as even as possible. And the reason why graphite powder is better than doing this, than shading the sky with a graphite pencil, is because you will avoid those lines and you will avoid creating textures, which you don't want when you're drawing a sky. Now I'm blending with a paper towel, and this allows for a very smooth and quick blending, as you can see. So I've already established a nice base value for that sky. I'm just going to make the top part of the sky a little bit darker and the bottom part near the mountains, near the horizon, a little bit lighter. And I'm kind of dragging this paper towel just to make that more even and make it look a little bit smoother. Now I'm going to continue drawing the mountain, And while I'm doing that, I'm going to be talking about the shape of the mountain, the light source, the things, some things like that. But let me say a few more words about the sky. The reason why I had to shade the sky first is because obviously I wanted to have a certain amount of value. Not just because it's not completely bright or completely light, but also because I'm going to be drawing some mountain peaks, some of which are covered with snow in the distance, and in order for those lighter parts of those mountain peaks to stand out, well, I need to have a darker background to create contrast, because you always need that range of value, you always need that contrast in value. So in order for the lighter parts of the mountains to show up, you need a slightly darker background. You need to shade the sky first. It's the same thing when you're drawing clouds, and we're not going to have any clouds here. It's going to be a clear sky, but it's the same thing when you're drawing clouds. First you have to shade the sky so that you could draw some clouds with your erasers. Now, once I draw some of these darker shapes or the shadow sides of the mountains, I'm going to draw some lighter sides using an eraser. So let me say a few words about that. I'm using a Tombow Mono 0 eraser here. You can also use a kneaded eraser. Eraser in a pencil is more convenient because it allows you to pull some of these finer strokes, but you know, you can use either one. Anyway, you can now tell from the way that I'm positioning these lighter details that the light side is on the left, which means that the light source is coming from the left. The shadow side is on the right. So the first thing I did was I drew the shadow side using Tortillion. I don't know if you noticed that, but when a Tortillion picks up a bit of graphite or charcoal, whatever medium you're using, it can be used as a drawing tool. So because I didn't want clear marks or lines, I wanted a softer contrast. I used a Tortillion with a bit of graphite on it, and I drew the shapes of those mountains, or the shapes of the shadow sides of those mountains. And then I drew the light side using the eraser. And now I'm using a pencil to add some slightly darker details here and there, where maybe you'll see some rocks or slightly darker shapes. But I don't really want to overdo it, because I want these mountains in the back to be a lot less detailed than the objects, than the elements in the foreground, because obviously they're further back, and there's going to be less contrast, less detail, and they're going to be maybe even a little bit blurry because of the atmospheric effect, because they're kind of fading into the distance. Once I've done those, and I think these look pretty good now because I've established a nice contrast between the light side and the shadow side, I'm going to move on to the middle part and the right side of those mountains. So I'm going to use the same approach here. I'm using a dirty Tortillion, a Tortillion that has already picked up a little bit of graphite, and I'm using it as a drawing tool. I'm using it in the same way that I would use a pencil. I'm just using it to draw some shapes, but these shapes are a little bit less defined. There's less contrast, there's not as much texture as there would be if I were using pencils, because pencils create texture, and texture means detail, or at least an illusion of detail, because our eyes perceive that texture as some kind of detail. So because these mountains are way back in the distance, I want to avoid those details and I want to avoid those textures. I want to simplify them a little bit. But what I do want to have is this contrast between those lighter details and darker details, or lighter shapes and darker shapes, because I still want to show their volume and shape using this contrast in value between the light side and the shadow side. So it's very important to define these contrasts if you want to explain three-dimensional shapes to the viewer. And of course you don't have to stick to your reference photo. You can improvise and approximate a little bit, because they don't have to look exactly the same. I never really stick to my reference photos. I often work from a couple of different reference photos, and I like to improvise a lot when I draw landscapes. And I think that's one of the best things about drawing landscapes, because unlike portraits, you can just sort of go with the shapes that you like, because if you compare the reference in the description with my drawing, you will see that I made quite a few changes, which I talked about at the beginning. I don't know if those decisions were right, and I don't really know if there are right and wrong decisions in this respect, but it just felt like this way the composition would look a little bit better, and after all I liked some of these shapes a little bit better. Anyway, now I'm going around some of these lighter shapes. I'm drawing some smaller shapes where I plan to reserve some light spaces where I won't go in with a graphite pencil. I decided to do that because I thought it would be a little bit difficult for me to achieve these details by just using an eraser. Obviously I can do some fine erasing with a Tombow Mono Zero eraser, but sometimes you can't get these lighter shapes to look as light as you want them to, and I want a lot of contrast here. And also sometimes you can't really get such clean edges as you want, so I decided to put in a few of these lighter shapes first, or rather work around these lighter shapes so that they would remain as light as possible, and so that I would retain that contrast between this these darker values and those lighter shapes. Now I'm also drawing some trees here, and these are the small dark shapes that I'm drawing with my dark 14B here. The way I draw them is I just draw some vertical lines, and I just add a few horizontal lines just to create a tiny conical shape that kind of looks like a coniferous tree in the distance. And I'm going to be doing that a lot. I'm going to be drawing a lot of these lines of these small evergreen trees in the distance, but the ones that I'm drawing here are a little bit closer, so I'm going to give them just a bit more value and a bit more contrast, and use a bit more pressure and work a little bit more on their shape so that I would define them a bit better. They are, after all, a bit closer to our viewpoint. So the trees, the further away they are, the less defined they're going to be, and the less you will be able to discern their actual shape and the branches and their canopies. But the closer they are, the more detail they're going to have. So right now on this left slope on the mountain, I'm adding a lot of these clusters of trees. Some of them are just individual trees, but most of them are just small clusters of trees. And here in the foreground area, I'm also going to have some rocks, because these are going to be some snowy or snow-covered slopes, but not all of it is going to be covered with snow, which is why I'm going to add a few of these bare rocks which are sticking out from the snow. These are of course going to appear darker, and their shape is going to appear very irregular. I started first with some moderately dark pencils like an 8B or a 10B. Did a little bit of blending, as you can see, and once I was happy with their shape, I added some darker details to make them appear a bit more three-dimensional and to make them look like they're raised above the rest of the ground a bit, because, like I said, these are the rocks which are sticking out and which are therefore not covered by the snow like the rest of the slope. Once I do those, I'm going to go back to drawing this peak in the middle, and I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to establish the contrast between those lighter snowy bits which are still covered with snow and the rocky bits which aren't covered with snow, which are a lot darker, where I will have a few more of these trees or clusters of trees, which will mostly appear as a bunch of small dark shapes. And while I'm doing that, I will also try to add some interest to the foreground area, because I don't want this to appear completely white, because that would be kind of boring and unrealistic as well. So I want to define those slopes a little bit better, and to create some suggestions of some variation in the terrain. But right now I'm still working on this peak, or the left side of this peak. Now you can see that the right side of this mountain peak is white still, and it's going to remain a lot lighter. So you may be wondering, well, look at those mountains in the back. The light side is on the left, and here it appears to be the opposite. Well, that's because this darker side of the mountain is not actually the dark side, and the right side is not actually the light side. The reason why the left side here appears darker is because it's simply not covered with snow. The snow has melted here, as you can see, and we can see a lot of trees and rocks there. That is why this part of the mountain appears darker. The shadow side of the mountain, which is facing away from the sun, is going to be covered with snow, which is why it will appear lighter. So I just wanted to explain that, just in case some people are confused by that and may perceive that to be some kind of a inconsistency with respect to the light source. It's not. It just has to do with the position of the sun and the placement or the distribution of the snow, or which parts of the mountain it covers, or where it has already melted. Anyway, adding some more details to the terrain, adding a little bit of variation in that terrain, making some part of those slopes a little bit higher, some of them a little bit lower, depending on how much value I'm using. And I'm also using some darker pencils to add these darker details, like to add these rocky, darker shapes in the foreground where there is no snow, where there are just some rocks sticking out from the snow. In addition to that, I'm also going to add some more shapes of trees in the foreground, and naturally, as I've already explained, these are going to appear a bit more defined in terms of their shape and detail, because after all, they are a bit closer to us. They are a little bit closer to our viewpoint. And the ones which are further away on those slopes are going to appear smaller and smaller because they're further away. Once again, if you check back look back at the reference photo, you will see that this whole slope on the right was kind of stretched out, and there was a wide white or almost blank area. I wanted to bunch these things together a little bit and to bring those trees a bit closer to the peak, so that's what I did. So I guess you might say that I changed the landscape entirely. But that's what I wanted to do anyway. So I'm finishing these details in the foreground and just sort of putting down some finishing touches on my drawing, because it's almost done. At this point, I would like to remind you to subscribe to my channel if you haven't already. I'm just refining some details on this mountain peak. I want to remind you to subscribe and to give me a like and comment if you haven't already. And check out my other videos. I have lots of landscapes. Also, if you want to see longer videos and a lot more content, if you want to see real-time videos and things like that, you should check out my Patreon. Anyway, like I said, I'm just putting down some finishing touches on this mountain. I normally draw landscapes in either charcoal or colored pencil, but this time I wanted to do one in graphite. I felt that graphite would be good for this type of scene. The drawing is now finished. I put my signature in the lower left corner, and this is it. Thank you for watching, and I'm going to see you in the next one. Bye for now.